Hi, everybody. Welcome back to episode 17 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I'm really excited to have back as my guest today E. Michael Jones, editor of Culture Wars magazine. Welcome back, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Ellen. Good to be back.
Great to have you. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the movie that came out. It played across the country last night called The Divine Plan. And it was about Pope St. John Paul II and Ronald Reagan during the Cold War. And it reminded me of a quote that you said in the last time I had you on as a guest for the podcast. And what you said was, after World War II, we had the anti-communist crusade. And basically the CIA went out of its way to recruit Catholic clerics because they knew the Catholic Church was against communism. And the culmination of this was Pope John Paul II working with Ronald Reagan to overturn the Soviet Union. This had a devastating effect on the Catholic Church because it made the Catholic Church too close to the American empire. So when I saw that this movie was coming out, I thought it would be awesome if you could go see it and I could go see it. And then we could talk about it because I knew that you'd have a lot to say about it and I knew I would want your take on it. So we both saw it last night and I'm eager to talk about it with you today. So I'll just jump right in. What did you think about it?
Thank you for bringing it to my attention. So I watched the movie and I'm walking out feeling dissatisfied. Wonder, why am I so unhappy with such an uplifting movie? And then I thought, well, they should have put it out in 1989. They should have brought this movie out in 1989 and we all would have walked out of the theater with a warm feeling in our hearts and we would have looked forward to a beautiful future, a future of peace and prosperity and freedom. The word that kept being used there, freedom, and all of these nice things. And we're walking out of the theater, my wife and I were thinking, why do we feel so unhappy? Well, because that movie, that alliance that was celebrated in that movie did not lead to any of those things. And then the question is, well, why did that not happen? Was there any indication here whatsoever that it was going to turn out badly? I mean, history was going to turn out badly. And the only indication in the movie was the sinister figure, Vladimir Putin, who was basically, we didn't say it quite that way, but basically it was all wrecked by Vladimir Putin. Well, I thought, wait a minute. Where have I heard this story before? And so I went back and I thought, well, what was the main achievement of the movie? I mean, basically, what was the main, Gorbachev and Reagan come together, and what was their main achievement? Well, they limited ballistic missiles, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. They signed it. It was proof that logos and reason and dialogue could triumph over fear and the Cold War and all that other type of stuff. Well, wait a minute. Did Vladimir Putin violate that treaty? Did he reject that treaty? Well, no, it wasn't. Who did it? Well, it was George Bush. George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. And so it turns out that the villain here is on camera, but he's not identified as the villain. The villain here is George H.W. Bush. It's the Bush family. And what happened to this whole detente after it happened, George H.W. Bush promised Gorbachev that the United States would not move NATO 1 inch eastward. Well, he lied. And not only did he lie, this was the opening shot in a war that almost destroyed Russia. Russia went into a tailspin after they signed these agreements with the United States. The United States ruthlessly exploited Russian goodwill. The United States sent a delegation of Jews over to Russia, and they looted the country.
Wait, when was this? When was this?
The mid-90s. Who am I talking about? Jeffrey Sachs was the head of the Harvard Development Corporation. Larry Summers was president of Harvard University at this point. Jeffrey Sachs brought a group of people over there. They signed covenants with the State Department saying that they would not personally profit from any of these agreements, and they violated every single covenant they made. They created the Russian oligarchs. They looted the resources of the former Soviet Union. That money all got shipped off to Wall Street, made the big stock market boom at that time. And Larry Summers ended up paying the largest fine that Harvard University ever paid in its history. Millions and millions of dollars because of their violation of the covenant they made with the State Department. That's the reality of this situation. That's a sad story. That's a really sad story. And I think the beginning of this problem, the beginning of the problem here is that they're not honest. They're not honest about what was happening here. Let's go to 1979. 1979 is a crucial year in this chronology. Okay, so 1979 is when Pope John Paul II shows up in Warsaw, and he says Mass in front of 1 million people in Warsaw.
And he's been Pope since 1978, right?
He's been Pope for 1 year, so this is his first time back in Poland. Okay, so this is huge. This is an officially communist, materialist, atheist country now, which has a huge Catholic population. And apparently you just can't suppress this. You can't suppress this religion. All of this religion comes out in some huge outburst of piety at that in June of 1979. Okay. Now, Ronald Reagan is watching television. This is part of the movie. And Ronald Reagan is inspired by this and says, we got to contact with this guy. We're going to work together. Okay. And then the movie begins from there. And then you end up with, well, why did it all go bad? Why are we now closer to nuclear war with Russia than we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis? Mm-hmm. Why did that happen? Was it Vladimir Putin? No. Well, what are we leaving out here? Well, part of the story we're leaving out is what else happened in 1979. The Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in February of 1979. Mm-hmm. In November of 1979, students took the American embassy employees hostage at the embassy. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened at that point? Most people don't know what happened at that point. I read the story. I've written about this story. The leader of the student occupying forces wrote a memoir. She had been grown up in Philadelphia. She spoke fluent English, and she was the spokesman for the students. And she said, we were planning to do it for 3 days. It lasted 444 days. Why was that? She said, we kept getting messages from the supreme leader to keep the hostage crisis going. Why was the supreme leader giving these messages out? Because George H.W. Bush had bribed the Ayatollah Khomeini to prolong the hostage crisis.
Wow. Okay. For what purpose?
To drive Jimmy Carter from office, to embarrass Jimmy Carter so that Ronald Reagan would be elected in 1980.
Okay.
This story came out. She adverted to it in her memoir. She said, I heard rumors of this.
George H.W. Bush was the head of the CIA at the time?
No, he was head of the CIA during the 1970s.
Okay. When this was all going on, what was his position?
He was soon to be the vice president of the United States of America under Ronald Reagan. So he was on the Reagan ticket or heading toward the Reagan ticket.
Okay.
So he basically used this to get Reagan into office. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's part of the story. That was missing. Why is that missing? Well, the point here is if you bring up what happened in Iran, then you bring up the whole history of the CIA and their involvement in overthrowing Mossadegh in 1953. And suddenly it's not, wait a minute, I thought the United States was a champion of freedom. Well, no, once you bring this part into the story, you have a whole backstory about how the CIA is using psychological warfare, basically to overthrow democratically elected leaders like Mossadegh and establish put in puppets like the Shah so that they can basically surround the Soviet Union and prosecute the Cold War. So
Hmm.
once you add this to it, it's suddenly, now it becomes a little bit clearer why things turned out badly. If you want the best explanation or the main villain here, it's George H.W. Bush.
It was this, the tagline of the movie is "Faith is freedom." Like totally conflating religious faith with like this idea of, freedom. And it was very good versus evil, right? And on the evil side, you have the Soviet Union and you have communism, and on the other side, you have John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and the CIA. And Bill Casey, who they brag about as being this Catholic who is on the verge of retiring, and then he comes out of retirement to come back for his final like Eagle Scout project to defeat the Soviet Union. And these are and they portray absolutely nothing of the dark side of the CIA and how the three of these work together. And I was actually pretty surprised that the CIA was in constant contact with John Paul II. It sounded like on a weekly basis there were memos and letters going between the Vatican and the CIA. I actually didn't know that. I was pretty surprised to find that out. But yeah, the whole thing was just very much, it reminded me of that anti-war song, "God is on our side." It was just so obvious that, and the whole thing, even the title, "The Divine Plan," was like, John Paul survived the shooting and Reagan survived his shooting. And this was a miracle by God to bring these two together just to defeat the Soviet Union.
Right.
I thought it was just like pure propaganda. And then the way that they worked in Putin, they kind of dropped him into the middle of the movie and said, he was probably in the KGB, and they tried to tie the shooting of JP2 to Russia. And then at the end of the movie, they bring it back around and they remind us that that was only round one of the Cold War. And now people of faith have to prepare for round two. So it was just pure propaganda against Putin and against Russia, in my opinion.
So what's the problem with Russia now? They're not communists anymore. They are a Christian country. What's the problem here? I don't get it. This is the whole point of now Donald Trump. Why is Donald Trump in trouble? Because he wouldn't go to war with Russia. He wanted to make peace with Russia, and the deep state, the military-industrial complex don't like that idea, and so therefore we have this problem. But the whole point of this movie is to make American Catholics feel good about being Americans, because you had this perfect alignment between the secular power of America and the spiritual power of the Catholic Church. And so there's no conflict between being a Catholic and an American. Look at Bill Casey. You can be the head of the CIA and be a good Catholic at the same time. That's the illusion that this movie tries to generate. And so it's like an exercise in nostalgia for baby boomers like me who lived through the thing. I lived through a lot of these different experiences.
Right. And another thing that they said too, there are so many things that they just seemed like such lies or half-truths. They were celebrating the fact that, communism was defeated without there ever being a shot fired, without any violence. And if you pay attention to what was going on, what the CIA was doing in, South America in the 80s, like the Cold War wasn't, as they say, it wasn't so cold. There was plenty of violence. There was plenty of war. There was plenty of subterfuge and murder, assassination, drug trafficking. Spying, blackmail, all kinds of evil things were going on that the CIA was doing during the Cold War. But this movie doesn't pay attention to any of that. They pretend like it was just this spiritual power that defeated the Soviet Union. And by the way, wasn't it really the Soviet Union's economic troubles that brought them down anyway?
The real story of the Soviet Union also began. The final act began in 1979 as well. Zbig Brzezinski, who showed up in the movie, was Carter's security advisor, and then he had a position under Reagan as well. he bragged in an interview in a French newspaper that he lured the Soviets into Afghanistan in order to pay them back for our defeat in Vietnam. So he lured them in there, and then they started fighting the war against the Soviets using proxy warriors. Basically, mujahideen, they were called the mujahideen, or holy warriors, who were recruited through the madrasas in Pakistan and then sent into Afghanistan with weapons provided by the CIA. So this was they claim the thing that brought down the Soviet Union. The defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was the beginning of the end. The other part that is not mentioned usually in this is that the Saudis were involved in both parts of this, but the Saudis were told to pump maximal amount of oil. That drove the global price of oil down because they have such a big share in the market, and that bankrupted the Soviet Union because they did not have the oil revenues they had together. So it was a combination of psychological warfare, hot warfare in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen as the proxy warriors, and also psychological warfare in Poland. So basically the reason that Poland could get away with what they did was because the Soviets were tied down in Afghanistan. So it wasn't just persuasion. It wasn't just friendly persuasion. It was warfare, as warfare got waged at that time in the 20th century.
And then, yeah, they say in the movie that the CIA basically funded the solidarity movement in Poland. Right. And
I knew about this because in 1988 I went to Rome and met with Frank Shakespeare, who was the American ambassador to the Vatican at that point. And I was asking about Medjugorje. I don't know whether you know about Medjugorje. It's this phony apparition in Bosnia. I was doing a book on that at the time. So I said, did the CIA, was the CIA behind Medjugorje? And he said to me, I can't answer that question, but this is the kind of thing we would support. And so it was clear to me that Medjugorje was to Yugoslavia what solidarity was to Poland. In other words, you're promoting a Catholic movement with geopolitical goals in mind. And that's what happened. So Shakespeare was there when Reagan met with Pope John Paul II the first time. He was there. Pardon me?
What did you say? Who was there?
Frank Shakespeare.
Oh, okay.
He was the ambassador.
Okay.
He was there. He wasn't there. He was in the room before they went in and spoke privately to each other. And then he told me that afterwards Reagan came out and Frank Shakespeare said, if there's anything you want me to know about your conversation, then feel free to tell me and it won't go past me. And that's when Reagan told Shakespeare that they were going to have this alliance that was going to bring down communism. So the question is, what price are you willing to pay? This is the question you have to ask the Pope. I know you don't like communism. You're now working with someone does not have clean hands, okay? You like Reagan, but Reagan's not the full story here. You're getting in bed with the CIA. You know what they're involved in. What price are you willing to pay in order to bring this about? And I think that by the end of his life, John Paul II felt betrayed and disillusioned because of his collaboration with the United States, primarily because of what happened to Poland after the fall of communism, how they rushed into the materialism of the Western kind without the spiritual revival that he was hoping for.
Interesting. Yeah, it was interesting that they said that he was presented a Medal of Freedom at the end of his life by George W. Bush.
Yeah, H.W.
George H.W. Oh, I thought it was the younger one.
No, maybe you're right. No, you're right. You're right. It was George W. Bush. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I just wonder how he felt about receiving that you know. But you
It
seem
was
to.
it was hard to tell because he was kind of ravaged by Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So he had a very expressive face, but by this time you couldn't really tell what he was thinking by looking at his face, and he
Yeah.
didn't say anything.
I made the mistake of reading another book before I went to see the movie, called The Improbable Triumvirate. Have you ever heard of that one?
No.
It's written by a guy who was, it's about the partnership between Nikita Khrushchev, John Kennedy, and John Paul the 23rd. And it was
No,
written by
John the 23rd.
John the 23rd, sorry. Yeah, and it was written by a guy who was like the unofficial ambassador from the Vatican to Moscow. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the way the Pope intervened in that crisis and was in communication with Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy. And the three of them were all working together to achieve peace and to prevent war. And it's just a really inspiring story. That was the next year. That happened in October of 1962, I think. And then, the next year in April, Pacem and Terris came out. He published that great encyclical on world peace, peace on earth. And then it was that following June when John Kennedy gave his address at American University, basically extending a hand to the Russians and trying to work these things out. It was that September that they finally, through a lot of work, got, what was the treaty that got passed that September right before he got killed? It was the nuclear test ban treaty.
Yeah.
And they got it passed and they said it. So there was like actual progress happening toward peace. And this was in the early 60s. And to me, if you're going to talk about a moment of hope during the Cold War, a moment when like peace was possible, I mean, you have to address this beautiful thing that was happening between enemies, when enemies were working together to try to save the world from nuclear annihilation. And of course, then JFK was murdered by our own government. I think we all know that by now. The CIA took him out.
Because he was going to put these people out of work. I think that was the motive here. I think it's exactly the same thing with Donald Trump. Whenever they feel that their livelihood is threatened by someone who has power, which the president of the United States certainly has, they have to do something. And in Kennedy's case, they murdered him. I think it's clear. It's clear. And I think the other thing that we have to understand is Christianity allowed for a realistic negotiations that would lead to peace. Christianity has that possibility. It has a kind of realism, and it has a transcendent view of life that allows that. It allows people who are seemingly opposites to come together on some type of mutually shared ground, or logos is what I would call it. But it was killed. I mean, let's be honest here. He was murdered by the people who were afraid that they'd lose their jobs if America declared an end to the Cold War.
Right. Yeah. And so it's like, it's kind of disgusting to me. I left the theater feeling the same way you did. I mean, I just was so angry because I'm like, why are we lionizing, Reagan and the CIA? Reagan to me seems like he was just an actor who was under the control of other people who were telling him what to do. He was playing a part. And then you have a real Catholic, John Kennedy. He was a sinner. He wasn't a great person. He did a lot of things wrong, but he was a cold warrior that turned to peace and really tried to do something. He reached out to his enemy. He wasn't trying to defeat the enemy. He was trying to make peace with the enemy. And John the 23rd was working with them. So why are we celebrating this moment, 25 years later? I mean, we could have prevented that whole thing that was going on in the 80s anyway if we would have let John Kennedy live and carry out his plans. To reduce, nuclear weapons and to get on friendly terms with Russia or the Soviet Union as much as possible. It's such a shame that whole era of history is just completely ignored by Catholics, or they don't know about it. But we're going to celebrate what happened in the 80s, and the CIA is going to be the big hero of this story.
Yeah.
It makes me mad.
I felt the same way. I felt really dissatisfied and unhappy after I watched the movie because
Yeah.
it doesn't allow you to understand the present at all. If the president is completely mystified, and the only, as I said before, the only attempt they make is to blame everything on Putin, which is preposterous. Putin saved Russia from the looters. Russia was on its last legs. The population went down in Russia during this period of time. That's a catastrophe whenever a population goes down. It's a serious catastrophe. And so what you see here are all these missed opportunities. I mean, so I remember when the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly people are talking about a peace dividend. And then there are people who are talking about, well, maybe we don't need NATO anymore. Well, we don't need NATO anymore. So why did you suddenly now extend NATO all the way from Berlin up to the Ukraine? And now you're trying to steal the Ukraine from Russia. Who's the villain here? Who's the villain? It's America. America is the evil empire. This is the phrase that was made famous by Ronald Reagan when he referred to the Soviet Union. America is the evil empire now. It's obvious. It's obvious. Why are you treating us to these fairy tales that obscure this fact rather than giving us a history that will explain that fact? Why are you doing this?
Yeah, I love the quote in the movie when it said that Reagan figured out that the Soviet Union was a kingdom of lies and secrecy, and the KGB was corrupt. And it reminds me of when you talk about Putin and Trump trying to extend trying to be something of friends with Russia, work with them instead of against them, and everyone always says, oh, but Putin was a KGB officer, and it's like, well, what do you think George H.W. Bush was? I mean, he was the head of the CIA. So are we saying there's like a massive difference between the KGB and the CIA? I mean, what's the difference? Do you think there's a difference?
Of course there's a difference.
What's the difference?
The difference is that one is supposed to be good and the other is supposed to be bad. But that's only the fiction created by this movie.
Right.
Okay, that's the problem here. I think the problem begins because you're eliminating certain things from 1979. You're not giving us a full history because I think it was an annus mirabilis, to use the Latin term. It was a remarkable year. But they're leaving out half the story because what I'm saying happened in 1979 is you had a twin insurrection against materialism. So you had the Poles. Yeah, that's right. The Poles were rising up against Marxist Soviet materialism. That's absolutely true. But the Iranians were rising up against American materialism under the Shah. And if you leave that out of the equation, you don't understand the spiritual significance of 1979. Because I think 1979, God was working in human history. And I think most people misunderstood what was going on. Michel Foucault, the homosexual philosopher from France, the revolutionary, went to Tehran thinking it was going to be a replay of the French Revolution. I mean, he was a sadomasochist, so I think he liked a lot of the violence that was going on. But it turns out it was the opposite of what he thought it was, because it was a resurrection of spiritual values after a materialistic regime. And that's, history didn't stop there. There's lots of problems that we could talk about in so far as the Ayatollah Khomeini resurrected Islamic fundamentalism. He resurrected, for Iran. He had Syed Qutb was the founder, one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He died in jail in Egypt after an insurrection against, I believe it was Nasser. Or it could have been Anwar Sadat. I forget which one. But the Ayatollah Khomeini had this book translated into Farsi and used it to weaponize the population, even though Persia is completely different than Saudi Arabia. They're completely different cultures, and the Saudis, the Arabs conquered Persia and they imposed Islam on them by force. And it's never worked. It's never fit. That's what Shia Islam is. It's basically a protest against the Arabic conquest. So this is all part of the mix of human history that keeps going on at this point, and none of it can be explained by this mythology that we're given.
Right.
If we were so wonderful, why is the world such a mess? Because we're in charge of the world, aren't we?
Right.
Aren't
Right.
we? So aren't we responsible for the mess? If the American empire is basically rules the world and the world's in a mess, America's responsible for it. How is that possible? Given noble people like Ronald Reagan, and he worked with the Pope. Well, that needs to be integrated into a broader narrative.
Yes, exactly. That's what I, yes, thank you for that. You're putting into words what I want to say, but I don't know how to. Last time you were on the show, you gave me some really good insight into Michael Novak and who he is, because I just didn't understand why these Catholics were advocating for these wars. So another guy that I see popping up a lot of times is this George Weigel.
Right.
So can you give me who is he, and who does he work for, and what's his deal? Because I really appreciated the insight you gave me on Novak. I just don't understand who these characters are.
George Weigel is Michael Novak's protege.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Michael Novak was looking for a protege for a while, and he came up with a guy named Terry Hall. Nobody knows who Terry Hall is, but he was his protege for a while until Terry Hall took on Father Brian Hare on nuclear weapons and just got obliterated in that debate. And at that point, well, Terry, you're cut from the team. You're going to the minor leagues, and that was the end of Terry Hall. And then they found George Weigel, and George Weigel did eventually become the protege. He's written this in a memoir, and he wrote about going to Poland. Michael Novak played a crucial role in Poland because right at the beginning of the 1980s, he wrote the book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. The purpose of this book was basically to attack liberation theology, which was coming out of South America at that point. But it was also meant to rehabilitate liberal economics of the English version of economics, Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, all these people that we think are economists, and there's no one before them or after them. He was to resurrect this and to harangue the Catholics that basically you don't know anything about economics. You got to get with the plan. You got to support capitalism, and here's your chance. And it was written right in the aftermath of basically the Reagan-Thatcher revolution that took place. And so this helped get Catholics on board. And to this day, you can find a lot of Catholics who espouse economic theories that are totally inimical to Catholic social teaching. It's that simple. So Novak wrote this book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. He wrote it when he was an employee of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a Zionist operation, Jewish operation, funded by leveraged buyout money groups like the Carlyle Group, private equity firms. And then we start agitating for reform, the overthrow, using solidarity for the overthrow of communism in Poland. And the book gets published in Poland, Samizdat, by unofficial copies get circulated. And it had a huge effect on Poland. And basically, this is part of the price that Pope John Paul II had to pay. He had to pay the CIA some type of fee, and this is part of the fee. It's basically opening Poland up to this corrupt capitalist economic system, which I think he ended up regretting. So when John Paul comes into the papacy, one of the first encyclicals he writes is Laborem Exercens. And in Laborem Exercens, he says, labor is the source of all value. Oh, wait a minute. Who said that before? Karl Marx said that. But also Adam Smith and John Locke. Well, that's because it's true. I mean, those people don't have anything in common, But John Paul II said it again in Laborem Exercens. Well, this blows up capitalism. It just blows it up. And so now what they're doing is basically putting Michael Novak on the Pope's case. And the thing that allows this to happen is the anti-communist crusade.
Wait,
So
hold on. Go back. So like you said, labor, he says labor is the source of all value.
right.
And you're saying that that blows up capitalism?
Yes.
How does that happen?
Okay. I wrote a book called Barren Metal, A History of Capitalism as the Conflict Between Labor and Usury. Thesis of that book is there are two options, two economic options, labor or usury as the source of value.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Okay. So that I got the title Barren Metal comes from Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice.
Okay.
So this is the classical understanding of economics. Shakespeare got it because he was a Catholic. And so Antonio needs money. He's a Catholic. The Jew is the money lender. Shylock says, I'd like to lend you money. And Antonio says, well, if it's breed of barren metal, keep it. Now, that's a direct reference to Aristotle, who said money is sterile.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Okay.
So money is sterile. Money can't copulate. Aquinas said you put 2 gold coins in a drawer and you come back 6 months later, all you're going to have is 2 gold coins. Put 2 mice in the drawer, you come back 6 months later, the drawer will be full of mice. Money does not copulate. It's sterile. Okay? But that's not what Shylock believes. So Shylock then turns to Antonio and he says, my ducats can copulate faster than Laban's ewes and rams. Well, what's he mean his ducats can copulate? He's talking about usury. He's talking about compound interest.
Okay,
lending money. So you've got these two options. And at the very moment that we're battling here, you have Michael Novak working for the Jews, coming out for capitalism, which is state-sponsored usury. At the same time this is happening, you have the Reagan administration. Is not totally his fault, but basically you got Paul Volcker at the Fed raising interest rates. This is usury. You can buy a T-bill in 1979, 80, 81. You get 20% return with no risk whatsoever. This is killing the economy. It is driving one company after another to the wall. It's the greatest recession we've had since the Great Depression. And you've got John Paul II collaborating on this because he wants to end to communism. So what's the price you're going to pay? The price you're going to pay is you have to listen to Michael Novak bloviate about capitalism at these candlelit dinners in the Vatican. And then the culmination of this is Centesimus Annus, the encyclical which comes out the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which is the beginning of Catholic social teaching. And this is Michael Novak's great triumph because he says now the Catholic Church has finally endorsed capitalism. Well, no, Michael, it hasn't. If you read the document, it says basically, if by capitalism you mean something that accepts the moral limits of the market, then capitalism is okay. If by capitalism you mean something where the moral limits are transgressed, no, it's not okay. Well, that's a conditional statement, and you've already proven that you don't respect the moral law with your capitalism because capitalism is state-sponsored usury. That's what Pesch said.
So are you saying that John Paul II sold out on that? Or are you saying that he didn't, but other people just interpreted his words a certain way for their own purposes? He
paid a price.
Paid a price.
He was willing to pay a price. And what do I mean by pay a price? He was willing to remain silent on certain issues about which he probably should not have remained silent.
I see. Okay. That makes sense.
Because he really hated communism. Okay, we all really hated communism.
Yeah.
Okay? If someone comes to you and say, look, you really hate communism, I tell you what, if you shoot your wife in the head, I'll abolish communism. Are you allowed to do that? No, you can't do that. Okay?
It reminds me a lot of this quote that's always stuck with me from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And he said, that the devil always sends errors into the world in pairs, pairs
Right.
of opposites. And that this idea that he's always trying to get you to run from one evil by going into the other one. That's
Right.
the other, and you have to, he says you have to walk straight between them. But that
Right.
reminds me of what you're saying about communism and capitalism. It's like we all turned against communism, but then we got sucked into the other evil of
Right.
of capitalism. Is that kind of like what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. What is Catholic social teaching? What's the image I can give you of Catholic social teaching? It's Jesus Christ being crucified between two thieves.
Oh,
The
wow,
left,
that's really good.
the left wing and the right wing, or as Father Coughlin would say, the left wing and the right wing of the same bird of prey. Jesus Christ is crucified between communism and capitalism, the two thieves.
Wow, I've never thought of that image before. That's really good. Thanks for that. I want to bring it back to the CIA because you mentioned something in our last interview. You talked about a little bit. You mentioned some things I always wanted to follow up with you on it. You said a few things had been controlled by the CIA, and so in order to kind of introduce this segment, I thought I would point out that are you aware that if you walk into the main headquarters of the CIA, they have a quote that's like inscribed either in the floor or in the wall, but it's huge when you first walk in. And it says, "The truth will set you free." And it's
Yes.
supposed to be, a quote from John 8.
Right.
But I've always found it infuriating, first of all, that they would have a quote from Jesus on their wall. But if you read the full quote in John 8:32, it says, if you remain in my word, you will become my disciples and you will know me and the truth will set you free. I just think it's kind of interesting that they leave out the whole part about Jesus and remaining
Right.
in Jesus's word, and they just have the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just that represents what they are. It's like this, they're trying to, well, yeah, it's just they're leaving out the part about remain in my word.
Right.
As if you know what I mean?
Right.
So I wanted to bring up the CIA. I thought I had this idea of like CIA Catholicism. Like, I do think that the CIA exerts a lot of, propaganda, psychological operations, information control. And there are certain ways in which, as this movie shows, Catholicism, the Christian faith, can be manipulated and used for their own ends.
Right.
And I think they're very good at doing that. And so I thought I would ask you if you could come up with a few things like you might be a CIA Catholic if, like, your faith might have been shaped by these intelligence services, our massive kind of leviathan of our empire that we live in. If the following things, like you might be at risk of becoming a CIA Catholic. I was wondering if you come up with a few of those.
Yeah, well, if we go back to when I was a young man, you might be a CIA, you might be a useful idiot for the CIA if you read Time magazine.
Yeah.
Time magazine was the propaganda ministry for the CIA. They worked, this is in the book I've published by David Wemhoff called John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the CIA. It's basically about that interconnection. There was a man by the name of C.D. Jackson who was on the payroll of the CIA and Time Life at that time, same time, drawing a check from both companies. And his job was to coordinate the workings of the CIA and Time Life. And one of the main black ops that Time Life got involved in was Vatican II. And their agent was John Courtney Murray. He was working to basically subvert the church's teaching on church and state, which is basically that the church is to the state what the soul is to the body. We do not believe as Catholics in the separation of church and state. Okay. John Courtney Murray's, the Jesuits' role at the Vatican II was to persuade the Catholic Church to accept the separation of church and state. So that was one of the main black ops that basically turned Catholics into useful idiots for the CIA. Time magazine. I know because I read Time magazine because my father subscribed to it. So as a 12-year-old, every week I sat down and read Time magazine from cover to cover.
Got it. All right.
It totally dominated the mind. And to get back to one of our favorite people here, when Robert Baer Kaiser got dumped as the reporter for Vatican II, who took his place? It was Michael Novak. And Michael Novak, this means that Michael Novak was working for the CIA to subvert the teaching of the Catholic Church. That was his job throughout his entire life. He never had another job. That's what he did. And at this point, he got started by becoming Time Life's correspondent for Vatican II and confecting this thing called the Spirit of Vatican II, which meant Time Life's interpretation of Vatican II, which meant the CIA interpretation of Vatican II, which meant the subversion of Vatican II.
Now, was Michael Novak officially working for the CIA, or you just believe he was like getting paid under the table? Like...
No, I'm not making that assertion. He was officially working for Time Life. Time Life was the propaganda ministry for the CIA.
Okay. Yeah.
So to what extent he knew that, or to what extent you let these lower level figures in on what you're doing, to be a successful operative in this, you have to be of one mind. You have to basically internalize the commands of your oppressors. And Michael Novak was good at that. He was good at betraying the church in the interest of Jewish oligarchs or WASP oligarchs who would pay his salary.
Okay. And then another thing you mentioned in the other show was like Christendom College, that the CIA was involved in the founding of certain Catholic universities. Was it just Christendom College, or was it like, are there others that you believe that they were?
I mean, I say that because Warren Carroll, the founder of Christendom, was a CIA agent.
Oh.
So the question is, do you ever stop being a CIA agent? And that's, I think the answer is no, not if they want you to operate. And so as a result, one of the things that happened during this period of time, so if we have the founding of Christendom by a member of the CIA, you have this obvious, at that time, it was easy to be a CIA Catholic because what the movie was about. You know, Reagan and John Paul II were fighting communism. What's your problem? Yeah. What's the problem with this? This is fine. This is great. And then after that, suddenly Warren Carroll comes out with this newsletter called Freedom Fighter. And I'm thinking, I'm reading this thing, I'm thinking, gosh, this is really great stuff. And then I'm thinking, wait a minute, how does Warren Carroll know anything about Angola? I mean, he's an old man living in Front Royal, Virginia. Did he fly over to Angola? Well, I think he was getting briefed by the CIA. Still, as president of Christendom, still producing this by producing this newsletter, which was full of CIA information promoting the CIA fighters in Angola as opposed to the Cubans who were in Angola. So that's why I said that. That's why I said that. But the whole point here is that these were just symbolic figures in what came to be the creation of the neoconservative Catholic. Mm-hmm. And neoconservatism had just a bad effect on Catholicism. Just had a bad effect. It was a too close identification with an American empire that was always involved in bad shit. Mm-hmm. So you talked about the truth will set you free. Well, Mike Pompeo bragged about, he was head of CIA, and he bragged about, he said, we lied, we cheated, we did all kinds of bad things. You're bragging about it, Mike. Yeah. I'm not edified. I'm not impressed by the fact that you're bragging about this kind of stuff, because we all know America's the evil empire now. America's the evil empire.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And so I would say too, I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot of reaction whenever you bring up John Kennedy. I feel like among certain Catholics, there's an immediate reaction of like, oh, he was a sinner. He was a terrible person. He was an adulterer. He was this, he was that. Do you think there was like a information war, like sort of against him to make everyone, I feel like people react that way when you bring up MLK and JFK. They immediately, what comes to mind aren't the great things that they did with their lives and the way they put their lives on the line, the way they worked for peace, but their adultery, their this, their that. Do you think that was just like an information war, propaganda?
No, I think first of all, even if it's true, there's plenty of people that do bad things and they never get called on the carpet because they're useful to keep that in the closet for them. So yeah, I think it's probably true. I think that Kennedy's tragedy was that he thought he could be a courageous leader without having leading an ascetic life. If you want to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for trials. And the best way to prepare yourself for trial is not sleeping with some woman other than your wife.
Mhm.
But but I'm saying, I mean, I agree with what you said. I think that he was trying to work for peace. He was using Pope John the 23rd as an intermediary, and he was murdered by people who did not want peace. I think that's clear, no matter what the official statement is.
Yeah, I think so too. And I just kind of feel like there's been this major like propaganda against him to so that that's what people remember instead of, selective memory about these things. You mentioned in the other one, Father Peyton's Rosary, that that he was somehow working with the CIA or
Yeah,
something. Is that true?
yeah, he was being paid by the CIA. So it was the Rosary Crusade. The family that prays together stays together.
Yeah.
They used this to get Catholics on board with the anti-communist crusade. That's the tragedy of Catholic life here. So the Catholics, the CIA is recruiting them as part of the anti-communist crusade, and yet at the same time the government is destroying their neighborhoods and driving them into the suburbs, and basically destroying the fabric of Catholic life in the United States. I
Yeah.
think I think Michael Novak knew that. I think he knew that, and I think it came out in I think the only honest book Michael Novak ever wrote, which was The Rise of the Unmeldable Ethnics, which was in the mid 70s at the time of the ethnic revival, when the great shift was taking place, when that Kevin Phillips predicted, when Nixon and those people moved large numbers of Catholics out of the Democratic Party as soon as the party came out in favor of abortion and moved them into the Republican Party. And that group of people elected Richard Nixon, and then they elected Ronald Reagan, and then they found a champion in Pat Buchanan, who did not get elected. And I think the same group of people, we're talking about their children now, but I mean that group of people also went for Donald Trump. That's a segment that people are trying to name, So Nixon came up with the silent majority.
Yeah.
And then Jerry Falwell came up with the moral majority. And then Hillary Clinton called them a basket of deplorables.
Right.
So, I mean, it's basically people who are trying to identify what I think is essentially a Catholic group. They're right to life, they're laborers, I mean, union members, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they swing the election, and they are the enemy now. They are the enemy now. Largely, they've always been the enemy, and so you're trying to recruit these people and exploit them and betray them at the same time. That's great. That's CIA stuff. That's CIA stuff.
CIA stuff. What do you think about like Opus Dei? Are they involved with the CIA? Are they controlled by, founded by? I feel like there's some kind of overlap there.
Okay. One of the main problems with Opus Dei is that it's a worldwide organization where you've got Americans promoting a regime. They're loyal to the regime in America, which is antithetical to the good of the rest of the world. And so you run the danger of lack of unity in this organization. Now, what they do is basically export a kind of Americanism. So you talk to, Spaniards, let's say, who are in Opus Dei. It's a Spanish operation, and they start talking like they sound like neoconservatives. They're still living in the past because, I mean, let's face it, communism was a real issue in Spain. Okay, Monsignor Escrivá grew up in the middle of the Spanish Civil War. It was a reality for him. They understand the problem with communism and they don't like it. But does that mean you have to like America? Does that mean you have to get in bed with the enemy of your enemy? And if you do, what are the consequences that will follow? So you hate communism. So therefore, you're signing on with gay marriage, right? Because America is now promoting gay marriage. Well, wait a minute. How is that possible? How can you still have this type of allegiance? That's the problem with Opus Dei. The Opus Dei in America came into being in America at the time of the high watermark of the anti-communist crusade, and everything was fine because they love this kind of Americanism, where your country is perfectly compatible with your religion. Well, what happens when it isn't? Then what do? Well, then you're in trouble, and I'm saying that's the crisis in Opus Dei right now. How do you disconnect from the American empire when the American empire is now the evil empire and the great Satan? How do you disconnect? And the problem is especially acute if you go to Washington, because there are lots of Opus Dei people that work for the government.
Mm-hmm.
So who are you working for? You're working for, is it God or Mammon? These are problems that they have to confront, and they can't confront. The fact that they can't confront them, I think, is the reason for this film. We want to just go back and forget all. Let's just bathe in nostalgia here. Let's just go back to the oldies but goodies. Let's play those oldies but goodies and remember the time when you were young and driving and all that type of stuff. It's a blatant exploitation of nostalgia here.
Yeah,
for the time when the United States government and the Catholic Church were involved in the same battle.
Yeah, and when we could see ourselves as innocent and the good guys and fighting, all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, the whole narrative relies on only telling part of the story and leaving out a huge chunk of the past and of reality. All right, well, that's probably enough about the CIA. I just had those questions for you. Can I ask you a few random questions like last time?
Sure.
Unless there's any more you want to say about the movie.
No.
Okay. Who's your patron saint?
Saint Michael.
Oh, okay. Next question. 9/11, inside job or no?
Are you trying to get me in trouble here? Are you trying to get me?
I just want to know what you think. I just want to know what you think. I mean, come on, you have to have an opinion on that. Like,
yeah,
I've never heard you talk about it.
It was an inside job, yes.
All right, next question. Are you in the CIA?
Yes, I'm a rogue CIA agent.
I think you could be. Like, you're pretty mysterious. Like,
actually, I was in Mashhad, and there were CIA agents there. Phil Giraldi was there. Mike Maloof was in the DIA, but a bunch of people there. And I said, I think I speak for everyone in this room. And I looked at the CIA guys and I said, what we want is a return from the American empire back to the American Republic. And nobody objected. So if you're asking me if I'm in the CIA, all I can say is, if I tell you the truth, I have to kill you.
Okay. All right. I'm just saying there is such a thing as controlled opposition.
Do you think I'm controlled opposition?
I think you could be. I don't know. Like, you're just kind of like...
Explain that to me. How am I controlled opposition?
Well, you pretend to speak out against the empire, but like, maybe I don't know. Maybe it's all just like a psyop, I mean, I don't know.
Thank you.
No, I don't think you are, actually. But I am kind of confused about, like, so you've made your living, like, creating a magazine?
Yes, honey. Yes, I did. I've done it for almost 40 years by the grace of God and the generosity of people that put their pennies together and buy this magazine. Yes.
The generosity of the CIA, maybe? Or
pardon me?
I'm just kidding. I'm joking. I said the generosity of the CIA.
I will state categorically, I have never gotten a penny from the CIA. I'll go even farther than that. I'm going to tell you something. Yeah. When I sent the Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA, and I asked them for all of their documents on Medjugorje. Yeah. So I got back 20 pages of documents, and 19 3/4 of them were blacked out. And then they send me a bill for $150. And I wrote back to him, I said, if you think I'm going to pay you $150 for this piece of crap, you're crazy. So I stiffed the CIA for $150, and I have lived to tell the tale.
Good
Now,
for you.
if a drone takes out my the South Bend, Indiana headquarters of Fidelity Magazine tomorrow, you will know why.
All right. Speaking of that, how much was your movie ticket?
It was I think it was $23 for 2 tickets.
All right. Well, I'll send you a check because I feel bad that you went to watch that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's tax deductible if you send it to me.
All right, great. So you've already talked about Putin. I was going to ask you what you think about him. What are your thoughts on just war theory? I ask everybody who comes on my podcast about just war theory. Do you have any succinct opinions on that, or is it?
Yes, it's a good thing. I agree with it.
Oh, you do? Why?
Because it's logos applied to warfare. It is the epitome of civilization to be able to apply logos to every form of life, including warfare, which means there's certain things that are sinful and immoral, even if they're committed in war. War is not an excuse to abandon moral behavior. This was the great, it began with the knights, with the Christianization of the warrior, and it extended all the way up to the present day. But then somehow we got derailed and we got involved in all sorts of ugly things like World War II was not conducted according to just war principles.
No.
It was a deliberate attack on the civilian population of countries like Germany and Japan. So it was fundamentally immoral. And so take that, Tom Brokaw, and you and your greatest generation.
Okay, so it's helpful. It's useful for Catholics to be able to understand the standards of how to conduct ourselves in war, so that we can understand what's moral and what's immoral in war.
Absolutely. Warfare is not an abrogation, should not be used as an excuse to abrogate the moral law. No way.
Okay, but then wouldn't you think that if we're being realistic about it, we have to admit that no government is going to conduct their war according to Thomas Aquinas's just war theory? I mean, that doesn't happen in reality, right? So isn't it it might be useful as a theory?
That's a cynical attitude. You shouldn't have, some young lady like you should not have cynical attitudes like that.
I'm a realist.
The whole point of Christian witness is to persuade people to follow the moral law, which means when it comes, I'm not a pacifist. I believe that there are certain times when war is justified or necessary, but even in those instances, you have to follow the moral law. Okay, you cannot kill innocent women and children, which is what the United States did with its bombing raids on places like Dresden. If a man starts walking towards you with his hands up, you're not allowed to shoot him, which is what we saw in that disgusting movie, Saving Private Ryan. This is Jewish subversion of moral behavior. I mean, it's not just pornography. Saving Private Ryan was a disgusting subversion of moral behavior.
Do you think that the just war theory prevents Catholics from engaging in that behavior in war? Do you think that it's only the non-Catholics in war that are doing those things? I mean, I'm just talking about on a practical level.
Are you asking me if Catholics are sinners? The answer is yes. If a Catholic is ordered to do something immoral, he has to refuse. It's that simple.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. So yeah, I think that's about it. For our last podcast, one of my favorite comments that somebody wrote in the comment section was, "This is an interview I can share with my mom."
Good.
And I thought that was great. I was like, yes, Catholics Against Militarism, interviews you can share with your mom. So I hope this is another one that you guys can share with your mom. Yeah, so thanks again for your time. I know this went for over an hour, but it's always great to talk to you and to get your opinion on things. I really appreciate it.
Good. My pleasure. Good talking to you, Ellen.
God bless. See you later.
Thank you. Thank you.